Okay, good evening. I trust that I can now be heard. Is that correct? Okay, good. So today is July 14th, and this is the Long Island and Staten Island Committee of Correspondence meeting, which the LaRouche PAC began because the news media is so outrageously disgusting and dishonest that, like in the American Revolution, when the British controlled the news, they created committees of correspondence with people running up and down the coast from town to town so that they could tell patriots what was going on. And that was the idea of creating many committees across the new country, the colonies, which became the Republic. So we have committees across the United States, and it is the case that also I am running for U.S. Senate. I'm challenging Chuck Schumer in the 2022 election as an independent candidate. And I'm joined tonight by my colleague Jason Ross, who is a member of the LaRouche PAC Science Team. And we're going to be talking tonight about how to make sense of the crisis that we are in. We are in a very, very dramatic situation. But before I get to that, we have a special presentation this evening. We will have a performance of the national anthem by Gregory Kaysen, who I think will be appearing here on your screen very shortly.
All right, good. You ready? Mm-hmm. Go. Oh, do it again. Do it over. Do it over. Do it over.
So maybe you can unmute us all, and so we can all applaud. Can we be unmuted?
Yay! Isn't that nice, Sylvia?
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to get started. And as I was saying, we find ourselves in a completely remarkable situation. And at the close of my remarks, before introducing Jason, we're going to hear Mr. LaRouche saying some things about the question of creativity, because it really is our creativity and our ability to think not as computers or robots, but as human beings, that is going to be crucial to getting us to the other side of this rather extraordinary situation. The backdrop is that we're really at the end of an era. We're at the end of the transatlantic financial system. People may recall 2008 September, and they said it was a housing crisis or a mortgage collapse, but what it really was a systemic blowout. And you remember the Congress voted against doing the bailout initially, and then Hank Paulson came running in and threatened that there was going to be martial law, that there would be total chaos, that the Congress had to act, and they came up with the first 700 billion troubled asset relief program, the TARP, as it was called. And then not too long after that, another 700 billion. Barack Obama was then a candidate. Well, he was in the US Senate. He, Chuck Schumer, Pelosi, and others helped ram this thing through. And then Obama became president and continued with the policy of these bailouts, which have been continuing until this time. And in September of 2019, we reached another new level when the big banks lost confidence in each other, so that they were no longer willing to do overnight lending at 2 and 3% interest rates, but started charging 10% interest, which would have skewed the whole system. So what happened was the New York Federal Reserve stepped in and began doing overnight loans of $75 billion at a time. And then in some cases, the loans would be extended, et cetera. So we're now in a situation where, and of course, then in January, February, March, you had the pandemic, which further exposed that the economy has already collapsed. It is simply not the case that the pandemic caused the collapse of the economy. The economy has collapsed because we've had 70 plus years of shutting down our productive capabilities, of free trade, of crazy ideas that it's bad to do work where you produce things. It's better to be white collar, and it's best of all if you can work on Wall Street and be a total crook and rip people off. That's considered respectable, whereas actually producing things, farming, being a scientist or other things is not considered respectable. The so-called post-industrial economy. We're at the end of that. And the virus has advanced it. We also have a danger, which Mrs. LaRouche warned of today, which I think is very real. It's not only the case that the people running the coup against the president intend to can you see me still? Because I'm frozen on my screen. Okay, good. At any rate, the people running the coup not only intend to blame President Trump for every COVID death in the United States, and to say that the United States is the worst country in the world in this, which it is not. We're not doing a great job, and Jason will talk more about that, but there are countries like Great Britain and Sweden who have higher death rates per capita than we do in the United States, and we should learn from what they did wrong and not make those mistakes. But at any rate, they want to blame Trump for that, and it is very likely that they would consider pulling the plug on the system going right into the November elections, handing Trump a complete blowout of the system. Which is going to come anyway, but they would trigger it at that time. So it's very urgent that certain measures are taken. What we are calling for is that a meeting which involves the most important nations, the United States, Russia, and China, their presidents. LaRouche's proposal had been the US, Russia, China, India, because that would be a bloc that would break the back of this British free trade system. What Putin has proposed is using the framework of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, that it should be those 5 heads of state, which also would be perfectly acceptable. So you're talking about the US, Russia, China, the UK, that's Boris Johnson, and France, Macron. we have the interesting situation that Boris Johnson, of all people, has actually called for an FDR New Deal. Now, he's only talking about 5 billion pounds, which is really nothing. That's not the scale of a New Deal. But the fact that Johnson has said the only solution to this is to build, to gear up production, we don't know if that's a typical British trick of trying to get in the front and take over a policy, or he means it. So let's put it to the test. Let's have the summit. And Pompeo, our Secretary of State, who I think is a very treasonous character, just like John Bolton, but nonetheless, he does do some meetings on orders of President Trump. So Pompeo had a discussion with the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and it looks like we are perhaps moving in the direction of such a summit. Now, we also want to make sure the content of the summit is appropriate to address the collapse. That means that these nations have to agree to stop the bailout and the implosion of the bubble. We have to preempt it, which means a return to fixed exchange rates. No more floating exchange rates, no more gambling on currencies. Nations have to have stability to be able to borrow over long terms so that they can actually build projects which take more than 5 minutes to build, like a national high-speed rail grid or several hundred nuclear power plants or major water management projects. These things don't happen overnight. So you need to have a stable currency at low interest rates to be able to do that. You need a Glass-Steagall system. You need the banks to be separated by function. After the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed by Alan Greenspan whispering in Bill Clinton's ear in 1999, we now don't have that separation. So your savings are literally being used as collateral for the banks gambling and speculating. And everyone knows the absurd situation with the US banks. You literally are paying to have your money in the bank. It used to be the case that you would earn interest on your savings. Not anymore. Now you pay for the privilege to have money in the bank, and you pay an arm and a leg if you have a credit card. If you owe debt, the interest is exorbitant. If you have a checking account, you pay for that. So we are paying for the privilege of being looted by a rotten system. That all has to change. So these heads of state have to address this. They also have to address the situation with the pandemic, because you cannot sit by. The head of the World Food Program, his name is Beasley, is a former Republican governor of South Carolina. He has warned that the virus is causing such dislocation, and in many poor nations, and it's similar in the US, we have what we call the gig economy, where people don't have a career, they don't have a regular paycheck, you're just scrambling to drive for Lyft or Uber, or you're working on a babysitting app, or now they have a dog walking app, or there are so many jobs that are really only temporary, and people are hanging by a thread, living from hand to mouth. Well, it's 10 times worse in nations in Africa, where literally if people don't work for a few days, they're going to be out of food and no place to get it. They may not have electricity, they may not have running water. Beasley warned that because of the locust plague and the dislocation and the fragility of our supply chains, you could have a situation where 300,000 people die a day of starvation. Imagine that. Imagine in a world which would allow this to happen. Also, if you allow the virus to spread unchecked in poor nations, you can be quite certain that it will come back here with a vengeance in the fall and the winter. And in the United States, we have not even gotten through the first wave, let alone the second. So there has to be a coordinated plan among nations to create a health platform where we work together, whoever is expert at producing masks or ventilators or water treatment systems or building modular hospitals, that it's coordinated. And we launch a crash program to make sure that the situations where people are desperately impoverished are actually addressed on a crash basis. And this creates the conditions where you can really gear up the economy. It does not have to be a trade-off where you say, oh, well, if we open the economy, then some people are going to die, but that's a risk we have to take because all the restaurant owners and the tattoo parlors are going under. So we've got to open them up and take a risk. And so we can't fight COVID. Our point is, if you really declared a war against the disease, then you would have to massively employ people, but maybe not at a tattoo parlor. Maybe you would have to have a crash program to train thousands of young people. We had the former Surgeon General, Joycelyn Elders, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche discussed a crash program of training people as medics. We don't have time for them to go through 9 years of medical school, but in a year, you might be able to have thousands of young people who could go to different parts of the United States, who could go to Brazil, who could go to Nigeria, who could help bolster the healthcare systems in these countries, who could man. The nation of Ghana actually has an ambitious plan to build 94 new hospitals. So we could do these things. We could massively gear up the production. People may know Ford and other manufacturing plants opened and brought hundreds of people back to work to produce PPE. Well, instead of shutting that down, maybe we should gear it up. So our point is, fighting the disease and reopening, as they call it, the economy do not have to be a contradiction, but are one and the same thing if you do it properly. Also, building major infrastructure construction. These are jobs that are outdoors. These are jobs where people are not in an office building spreading the disease, that you can work with a reasonable, precautions, and you're not going to spread the disease, but you're going to be employing people, you're going to be building things that you need. So this is the approach that has to be taken. Now, what else are we facing? You've heard the news. We've had this as part of the coup, and I should be very clear, the coup against President Trump is not merely a coup against Trump. It's not just to try and shape what happens in the elections. This ongoing coup is an operation to destroy the identity of the United States. So you had something that was used as a trigger, which was the murder of George Floyd by a police officer in a racist, ugly, brutal fashion, which got very many people upset because there are issues of police brutality in the country. People know that there are problems of racism. It is by far not the majority of our police officers, but people have a sense that there's a lot of injustice that hasn't been addressed. But what happened is this was funded by this Black Lives Matter organization funded by George Soros, run by the British, and has nothing to do with stopping racism or stopping police brutality, but has to do with tearing down statues and making our country ungovernable. And you have situations like in New York City right now, where I think over 400 police officers resigned. This month, they had to put a hold to try and not allow any more police officers to resign. You have calls for eliminating the police departments altogether. And what they're not addressing is the problem. We also have to think about what the police are being called upon to do. You have a situation where people have been in lockdown for 3 months, where people who have difficulties like mental illness, families who didn't have mental illness but who are completely claustrophobic and sick of being together, who have severe anxiety because their livelihood has been disrupted, who haven't paid their rent for 4 months. There is enormous stress on the population. Police are trained to be law enforcement officers. They are not psychiatrists. They are not psychologists. They are being sent into situations which our nation shouldn't be in, that are symptoms of a dark age, which are virtually impossible to handle. So it's a kind of a setup. Whereas what you really need is to transform the entire situation with a quality of optimism and growth, that people know that there is a future, that they know when the pandemic, when things can open again, and it's unclear when that will be, that they are not going to be evicted or foreclosed upon, that there's going to be work, that there's going to be a future for their children. And that would go a very long ways to chilling out the situation that we're confronted with. So we're facing a real cultural problem, and we want to, part of my campaign is to actually do a series of videos about various American heroes who are memorialized in statues and memorials, and to remind people what our history actually is, because it's simply not true that our nation was founded by a bunch of racist slave owners. Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, all were vehemently opposed to slavery. They tried to actually have it outlawed in the Constitution, but because of the combination of people there, we couldn't get rid of it at that time. But you don't build a nation on slavery. There's a limit to how much the human body can do. I suspect that even our greatest weightlifters today probably cannot lift 10 times more weight than people could lift 200 years ago. That is, if this lie that our nation was built on slavery, you can't build any nation on slavery. You have to have industry. You have to have machines. You have to have scientific progress. When the British backed the Confederacy, why did they do it? Because they knew if the United States remained dependent on slave labor, we would never develop. So this is not discussed. This is not taught. Young people today, unfortunately, have very little idea about what a breakthrough our successful defeat of the British Empire was for mankind. The entire planet was hoping that we would defeat this evil oligarchical system, which we did. And our nation is still in the process of perfecting the idea of what it means to govern oneself. And the principles in our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence are universal principles about the equality and dignity of man. And this is something to really be proud of and to really fight to perfect. Now, along those lines, I just want to say a couple other things. One, the Roger Stone case, where his sentence was commuted, President Trump was absolutely correct in doing that. The entire case against Roger Stone never should have been launched. There was never any proof, and the people at CrowdStrike and the DNC admit that they never had any evidence that Russia hacked the DNC. The thing was a fraud from beginning to end. So the whole thing should be thrown out. And people who are on Fox who claim to be Trump supporters, saying that this was a mistake or shouldn't have been done, are just way off base. And when measures are taken to restore justice, people feel rightly optimistic, as they should, and I think many people did in that case. So I think I'm going to stop because I would like to play something by Mr. LaRouche, which I think puts us in a proper frame of mind to consider, because it's not so much the facts, so-called facts. There's an infinite number of little pellets of so-called facts and information. Having that doesn't mean you know the truth, and it doesn't mean that you know how to sort things out and figure out a projection. Where are we headed? What are the consequences if we do X versus what are the consequences if we do Y? Can you imagine where mankind should be 50 years from now? These are really the important questions. So I'd like you to hear from Lyndon LaRouche on that.
What's happened is the destruction of classical culture has been an essential part of the destruction of the mental capabilities of the population. Classical culture has a very specific significance. What happens when it becomes merely entertainment without criteria, then the people lose a mooring. The key issue here is always in humanity is what we call creativity. Now, creativity is not, variation. It is not innovation. Creativity respects certain principles of the mind, which only really classical cultures can convey. What we've had is people have been lost their connection or never had it to classical culture. And therefore they go out in life and they find themselves crippled by the lack of classical culture's access. That was to think creatively occurs only in classical culture. Now there's authentic classical cultures, and there are authentic classical cultures. We can trace them all the way back to the classical Greek in particular, which is fairly well known. We have other cases of that, classical culture. And they come in different sizes, so to speak, and different flavors. But they all have certain characteristics. And it's a subject in itself as to what classical culture is. It's one of my specialties, but I don't find everybody is familiar with that specialty. But this classical culture has a very specific, unique role in developing the powers of the human mind. And the lack of development of the human mind in that direction is actually an impediment to progress. It doesn't mean you're bad. It means that you have not acquired this weapon, shall we say, the weapon of progress, the present weapon of mental progress. And we have denied most people in society of familiarity with what this concept is. And therefore they're cut off from something they should have the right to know and the right to experience. If someone was given, say in music, and was given a real systemic education in what musical composition is, they would find it not difficult to begin to understand what it's all about. And they would be able to understand what's wrong with the alternative. Because when you discover that you have powers of your own mind, which you discover you were not using, and now you begin to get acquisition to those powers of the mind that you weren't using, you begin to find that you are much more important than you thought you were. And it's that role of classical culture, which is, shall we say, the beginning entry point of classical culture, when people realize that there's something there which they can't get in any other way, and it means something to them, because they understand themselves better than they did before. Then they find a source of strength in that. And the first thing I'm concerned about is the inner sense of the source of strength inside the person. And classical culture, as any, for example, scientific education and so forth, these things strengthen the person inside because they have access to more power over society and society's condition than they do otherwise. In the sense, when they say, well, I am somebody, I am something, I mean something, I'm not just a thing. I got something inside me that you need to know. I've got something inside me I need to give you. And when you can say that to your audience around you, you feel strong. You feel happy. The world is more yours. You don't have to excuse yourself for what you are. You don't have to make apologies for what you are. I learned something yesterday, buddy, and it's good. And that's the kind of thing I would like to convey to people who ask this question, exactly that. We have access, as probably with classical art and so forth, and science, we have the means to enable people to make breakthroughs, even on a fairly limited beginning basis, where they can appreciate what their mind is, what it represents. And once you're sure that your mind means something, then you're empowered, and you're not easily crushed. You don't have to defend, you don't have to apologize for yourself.
Great. So with that, I'm going to go to Jason Ross of the LaRouche PAC Science Team.
Okay. Hey, Diane. Thanks for having me on. Lynn's a tough act to follow, isn't he? So I wanted to talk about, not in too much detail, was a few things about the coronavirus situation and about economics, and try to do it from the standpoint of how to sort out all of the very different messages that we're hearing all the time. I mean, on the coronavirus, for example, there's like 1,000 different things being said. It is really hard to try to figure out what's what. So we're going to maybe come to some conclusions tonight, but also I hope have some discussion about how you try to suss out whether something is right or not. You know, you've heard a rumor, you have an idea, maybe it's an idea that you believe yourself, and what are the steps you can take to try to disprove it, just to make sure that you're really right about this. So let me show a few examples. I've got some slides that we can pull up here. So take, for example, this. This is February 29th. This is the Surgeon General of the US saying, seriously, people, stop buying masks. They are not effective in preventing general public from catching coronavirus. But if healthcare providers can't get them to care for sick patients, it puts them and our communities at risk. February 29th. In the next picture, we see a headline about CDC Director Redfield, who said that if everyone wore a mask for the next 4 to 6 weeks, we could drive the pandemic, quote, into the ground. Now, this is just, I think, today or yesterday. This is a huge change in what's being said over a period of a few months, which makes some people wonder. They say, well, gosh, if wearing a mask is such a no-brainer, why didn't people just say that 4 or 5 months ago? Partly the answer is that there was a concern that there weren't enough masks and they should be prioritized for healthcare workers. But overall, it was incredibly, it was super unclear. Let's take a look at another picture. The next slide, we've got a tweet. I don't care how many dirty looks I get for not wearing a mask. I'm relatively young and healthy and have not had any symptoms of flu, aka COVID. I respect those around me. I don't try to force my beliefs on them, and I respect their decision. Remember, fear is a very powerful weapon. And then just one example response to that. I don't see why more people don't question the insanity of this. Never before have we required healthy people to wear a mask to protect others. From what? They are healthy. There's nothing to protect. So on the surface, that sounds like a reasonable question. If you're not sick, why do you have to wear a mask to protect others? And the thing is that this points to some of the troublesome things about COVID, what makes it so hard to control, which is that pretty much everybody who gets it, it takes almost a whole week, usually about 5 days, before you start to feel sick at all. That means that everybody who eventually will be contagious with COVID spends at least a few days being contagious and feeling totally fine. Everybody goes through that stage, everybody who catches it. So, you know, that's the reason why you say, well, how do you know you're healthy? You really just don't. You can feel fine and you could still have a disease that could kill somebody that you cough on next to you. Let's take a look at a couple more that have come up. So here's a picture. This is from 1918. This is when the Spanish flu was sweeping the world. Here's healthy people wearing masks. Next picture. This is San Diego, 1918. You see some young kids or very young men out for enjoying themselves outside wearing masks. So let's jump ahead to another thing that we've heard. Some of the ideas that came out early on included this one, that 5G was the cause of COVID. Does anyone remember hearing that people said that the cities that rolled out 5G first got COVID? So, Wuhan was supposedly a center of 5G rollout. Italy was getting 5G. Now, we clearly don't have the US is not the land of 5G. So this is just one of those things where it's like, where did this really come from? And, I'm convinced that some thoughts that are just really unjustified are put in place deliberately, not just so that people have ideas that don't mesh with reality, but also to try to really prevent people from thinking that it's possible to come to conclusions at all. Let's take a look at another one that people believe. That Trump is the source of all racism in the United States. The US was great, we just had a black president for 2 terms, and now all of a sudden Donald Trump has come and got elected by all those racists who just, in the country that just voted for Obama twice. It sort of doesn't really make any sense at all, right from the beginning. So why is that idea so, widespread among some people who don't think too deeply about it? And then how about one more? What about China and COVID-19? Is it true that China held back knowledge about the virus early on? Is it true that China shut down domestic flights within its borders while still allowing international travel to leave Wuhan? That was a fake idea that got presented around the world. It was started by one of the biggest supporters of the British Empire, Niall Ferguson, who's written books about how great the British Empire is. He put out this fake idea about the international flights continuing after domestic ones shut down. Eventually, that ended up getting picked up by Peter Navarro, who's a lunatic, Mike Pompeo, who's crazy, and unfortunately, also in some cases, Donald Trump. So what Diane was talking about the coup against the president and against the president's intentions, essentially warfare against what Trump might do. Well, part of that is included in pushing Trump in certain directions for electoral or other reasons. When a DC-based think tank gave the Republican Senate committee a playbook to say, hey, here's how you're going to win the election. What did they say? They said, blame China. Make that your electoral basis. It'll work. You'll get reelected, or you'll get new people elected. That's the way to go. So the U.S. response overall to the coronavirus, in some ways, it's been very good. Here are some of those ways. The travel restrictions early on, that was a good thing. The Army Corps of Engineers building temporary hospital facilities, that's great. The deployment of the Navy hospital ships. They didn't really serve that much of a purpose directly, but it sent a message that, hey, we are trying everything that we can to be able to support people in need of healthcare. Operation Warp Speed. This is an initiative that got started a month or 2 ago by the White House to deal with the fact that it could be a big risk to try to produce in advance your vaccine or antiviral drug before you know that it works. So usually if you're researching a drug, you gotta make sure it works, you gotta do a bunch of tests on it, and then once you know it's good and it's approved, then you start building your factory and setting up or configuring your factory to produce that medicine. Well, in this case, what the White House did through Operation Warp Speed is to say, let's sort of narrow it down to maybe a half dozen really promising vaccine candidates, antiviral therapies, and let's just go out on a limb and let's put out the money so that they can start building up their manufacturing right now. So if it is effective, we'll be able to start having those first doses come to us as early as late summer, early fall. This is for an antiviral that is got Operation Warp Speed funding, or to get a vaccine out very quickly. So if it turns out that one of these things doesn't work, okay, so it's money down the drain. But if it does work, it means it'll really speed things up to be able to get it out there and make sure that we have a supply of it. So that's an excellent thing that the US government has done. Using the National Guard to help set up federal testing centers, that's a very good thing. Being willing to use the Defense Production Act to force industrial firms to help with gearing up production of ventilators, that's a very good thing. So those are some good things. There's also some not so good things. In the first month, in February, the CDC said that it was going to make all the COVID tests. And so it sent out COVID tests around the country, and they were defective. They didn't work. So they had to sort of remedy that. Also in the month of February, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, I mean, basically in a sort of bureaucratic type of thing, did not allow any private labs to develop COVID tests. So it was all hinging on the CDC, which is crazy because we have many talented biotech companies in the United States that can do research and get things going. So that really cost us a month, that failure by the CDC, that screw up, and then also the FDA dilly-dallying and taking forever to let private companies develop COVID tests. Another thing was the protests. You know, the fact that healthcare workers that were urging everybody to socially distance, to wear masks, to wash their hands, that thousands of healthcare workers signed open letters supporting the protests vaguely related to racial justice that broke out in the United States last month. Very irresponsible and very, very weird messaging. Again, say, well, what is this, a deadly virus or not? You know, if you're fighting oppression, does that make you immune? No, it doesn't. And then the other thing is on the mask issue. Look, the U.S. took a while for its government agencies to say, yeah, you should wear a mask. But it wasn't alone. The World Health Organization poo-pooed mask wearing. So what the Surgeon General said in February, that's what the World Health Organization was saying as well. There was just a lot of screw-ups on this. But the most important thing is about the last 50 years and the fact that today we aren't able to very rapidly produce vaccines. I mean, we're actually doing pretty good work, you know, making these vaccines very fast. There was actually just an article that came out today in the New England Journal of Medicine about the Moderna vaccine. So they tested it out, they injected it, they vaccinated people in March and April. And what they've seen is that they created antibodies at kind of basically around the same level as somebody who just got infected and recovered. They used sort of synthetic COVID virus just for safety. They didn't want to have the real virus in the lab. They used synthetic COVID virus, and then they took the blood from the people who got the vaccines, and they found that, oh yeah, it would attack the virus. So that's very promising. But the fact is that over 50 years, we have failed to eliminate poverty on this planet, something that could easily have been done over the past 2 generations if there had been an intent to do it. The fact that over the last 50 years, the huge breakthroughs in science that we had seen in the 19th century and in the very early 20th century, you know, through 1905 and Einstein's work on relativity and the quantum and Planck's work, these are huge breakthroughs in knowledge. We have not had the kinds of like really radically awesome breakthroughs in biology that we could have in the last 50 years if we had really put the money into it. You know, I think that a lot of virologists say we could have had a universal influenza vaccine at this point, which that's not COVID, but that would still be, you know, why don't we have that? Why do we have a new flu shot every year and they don't even really work that well? So the fact is that what we have to achieve right now is, yeah, we do need to figure out how we're going to respond to this virus, because it's it is a pain in the butt, right? You can't see your friends. You know, you probably can't go to work depending on what your job is, or if you do, it's it's awkward. You know, it's a shame. It's lousy. And some countries on the earth have they've sort of taken a very different approach. They took an extremely strict and rigorous approach early on. I'm talking about China, which was very, very strict about things in Wuhan, shutting down the whole city. I'm talking about Vietnam, which closed its borders early on and did testing and quarantining for any Vietnamese returning to the country, as well as providing government, like essentially hotels, a place for people who are sick to go and get out of their house, not infect their family, go and get healthcare if they need it, but isolate outside of the home. New Zealand, New Zealand has basically no cases at this point. So it just goes to show it is possible to defeat this thing pretty well, even without a virus or vaccines yet. So when you think about how great it would be to get back to life as normal, and how the only way to make that possible is to really beat back this virus. You know, vaccination on a large scale, this is going to take a while. But if we had continued bringing the numbers down as we were back in March and April, May, if we had continued that and we got them like way down, you know, you could have counties or states that have essentially no cases. And then there you'd say, hey, going back to school, it's really different in a county with no coronavirus cases, to think about that, compared to in, you know, someplace in Arizona where the cases are skyrocketing. So just get, you know, beating this virus, being able to get back to work, being able to get schools going again, you know, that would be great. And my view, dilly-dallying about it and taking halfway measures, it just costs more in the end, because it just draws out how long we have to sort of be in this halfway open, halfway closed kind of stage. So, okay, maybe that was quite a bit of detail about about COVID, but I want to say, just to sort of put that in a broader context, you know, this really goes to the point about how urgent it is to have discussion on the biggest issues facing humanity among the most important countries in the world. You know, it is an absolute crime that US, Russia, US, China relations are as terrible as they are right now. It's a real terrible shame that China-India relations are also very, very difficult right now. If these countries aren't able to meet and discuss with each other, it's going to be, I think, not possible for any individual nation to really get out of this paradigm of finance instead of physical production, this paradigm of green instead of productive, where solar panels are praised as being sort of like a mark of holiness, even though they don't make very much electricity, they're a waste. To get out of that paradigm and to rebuild in a New Deal kind of way, the infrastructure, including here, but also collaborating on eliminating poverty worldwide, which needs, as one of its first stages, developing the physical infrastructure that the rest of the economy depends on. So President Putin's call for meeting a summit of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, this is just, it's absolutely essential. It's the way to get past the sort of British, you know, control over so much of thought, and to really, really break out and think how we're going to work together with other countries based on the fact that we are all human beings, and what that means is we are not animals. Animals can't create new resources for themselves. We can. Animals can't go to the moon unless we bring them. We can. Animals can't discover new medicines, or any at all, right? We can. So the whole basis of economics, it's not about money and stock markets and allocating resources. It's about how are you as a society fostering those great new thoughts, that creativity that will be the key for the enormous changes in our relationship to nature that are needed. I'm not talking about you know, an iPhone that has 4 cameras instead of 3, or 5 instead of 4. I'm talking about nuclear fusion, about redefining our relationship to water, to raw materials, to energy. That's the kind of level that we have to think on when we put out our long-term perspectives, and not be fooled into just looking at things day to day and responding to crap that's thrown at us. We have to have a vision. Where are we going to be in 50 years? And how are we going to make that vision a reality? And I think if we work together, we can get the United States able to play a very useful role, a crucial role in the world, in advancing mankind that way. So that's what I'd like to say.
Great. Good. So I think we're going to open it up for questions. I would like to just say that tomorrow night, Daniel Burke, who's running for U.S. Senate in 2020 against Cory Booker, and I will be holding a nationwide town hall on the question of policy and on the question of the LaRouche program for 1.5 billion jobs worldwide, spearheaded by 50 million productive jobs in the United States. And I would really like to encourage everyone here to help us get the word out on that. I think Dave is putting the RSVP link in chat on the Zoom. So if you look at the chat box, you can see that. So that being said, let's open it up. And if too many people talk at once, we can use the raise your hand thing, which you get to by going to, I forget how, someone can explain, Chris or somebody can explain how to get.
The actions at the bottom of the screen. You can raise a hand there if you like.
Or you can just unmute and start talking and we'll see how chaotic it is.
How about this?
Go ahead.
Hi, Diane. Glad to make it here. Yeah, just like off of Independence Day, I've been telling people for probably quite a few years now, probably to deaf ears, is we basically have to defeat the British Empire again to get out of this mess. And thinking Daniel, but no, Jason was talking about the WHO. Well, they lumped in with the IMF and the WWF, which goes back to the British Empire also. And we have to create a movement somehow that somehow makes the Sunrise Movement and organizations like that look very tiny to help get out of this mess. Thank you.
Good. What you're saying brings to mind the Mask of Anarchy by Shelley, where they say, rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number, shake off, what is that? And then we are many, they are few. What is the words? Someone's saying it.
Chains for earth like dew when slumber had fallen on you. Oh, well, anyway, I guess I don't remember it well enough to jump in. Sorry.
That's okay. But the idea is, look, the British Empire and their green agenda, and remember, Mark Carney of the Bank of England, formerly, now he's the UN spokesperson on climate change, and Mike Bloomberg, and Carney was bragging that they have, I forget how many banks with tens of trillions of dollars to shut down everything and kill people, because if you get rid of carbon, you get rid of energy, then people die. Well, they have said very clearly they think the world can only sustain 1 billion people. That means there's another 6.9 billion people that they want to get rid of. So who is the majority in this situation? That is, it's a matter of organizing and reaching out to people with the solutions to defeat this. The other aspect of it is that they really are bankrupt. I mean, the bubble that's been created by these bailouts since 2008, the figures I've heard is that it's about 40 times larger than the bubble of 2008. So when this thing blows, it's going to be much worse. The danger is, as I said, that these people, and you may or may not remember this guy, I think his name was Dudley or Bradley, he was the chairman of the New York Federal Reserve under Obama. And he was quoted saying that the Federal Reserve should make sure not to do anything that would allow Donald Trump to be reelected. He later took that back. But what that could also mean is stop the quantitative easing suddenly without Glass-Steagall right before the election, or some move like that that would just trigger a complete collapse and pandemonium, which would then be blamed on President Trump. And that's why this meeting of the heads of state, the introduction of Glass-Steagall. These actions are very, very urgent in order to preempt this and also to get well underway a real crash program to reindustrialize the United States, which is a challenge. The other thing is, if you think of the timing of the riots, you remember we had just launched the SpaceX NASA launch from Florida to the International Space Station. This was the first time in 9 years that we had flown American astronauts on an American-made rocket from American soil. It was a huge breakthrough. It meant a potential great change in direction for the country. So people were very, very happy about it. And within a couple of days, this was completely covered over by the viral news coverage of the murder of George Floyd and the riots. And people have almost forgotten it. And in fact, the House version of the NASA budget is $3 billion short for what is needed to actually successfully carry out the Artemis manned landing of the first woman and a man on the moon by 2024. So in a sense, you know, absolutely, we have to defeat the British Empire for good. And that means also educating Americans as to what the actual enemy of the United States is, as opposed to what you're told on television or in the New York Slimes or Fox or anywhere else.
Hey guys, are we trying to make a quote from Percy Shelley about the lions?
Yes, why? You have it right.
It goes like this: raise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable numbers. Shake your chains shake your chains to earth like dew. Which in sleep had fallen on you. There you go.
Exactly. And then the part about we are many, they are few.
Right. Yeah. Hey, listen, I memory is not that good no more, I guess.
It's happening to all of us.
I have a question for Mr. Ross.
Yes.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
I read an interview about George Soros and how he wanted to give away, I think it was half of his, vast fortune to help different societies to have more equality and, the usual dribble. I am not a fan of George Soros. However, you made the statement that the British Empire is affiliated with him, and I'm just wondering how do you know that? I also want to say that George Soros is funneling millions of dollars to Black Lives Matter, and some of that money is going to the Biden campaign. This is what I've read.
Well, Soros is definitely putting big bucks into the Democratic campaigns overall. As far as his British pedigree, I think Diane may have more to add on this than I do, but I believe that that's where he got his start and his first financing, whether in England or not, through British financial firms. So, for example, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and Diane will no doubt be able to correct me, that he's also been involved in managing some of the Queen's personal assets as well. That's really all I can say. I'm afraid I'm not a big expert on George Soros. I think Diane had referred to him.
Okay, thank you. I would have to say, if he's giving away half his fortune to these different groups, I ask myself, what's an opportunistic guy like him getting out of it?
Well, I'll tell you what you get out of something like this is you get to shape how the world is going to be. So you call it charity, but what it means is, hey, I'm going to have a big role in what the world looks like. I'm going to make decisions. I'm going to finance these groups that are going to push for political reforms or changes in this direction versus that direction. So you get to have a huge say, or you think you might get to have a huge say in which direction the world goes. So I don't think George Soros is truly a humanitarian. I do think that Bill
No, I don't
Gates
either.
yeah, I mean,
Thank you
like
for
just to
that.
make a contrast, I mean, I think Bill Gates actually is sincere in his intents on health, on saying, hey, you know what, I got way more money than I could possibly use. Um, you know, I'd like to give it away, and health seems like something I'd like to do for that. So, you know, not every person with a ton of money who gives it away is bad. Like Carnegie. I mean, when Carnegie set up all these libraries around the United States and around the world, that was a good thing to do.
Yes.
Gates probably is interested in funding the vaccine, but he also is one of the main proponents of the myth of overpopulation. And he is a wacko otherwise, but it's true.
Interesting.
People are complex. Soros, I actually doubt, is giving away 50% of his money, although maybe it's dawned on him that he might die at some point and he doesn't care as much if he has only a couple billion as opposed to several billions. I don't know. He did manage the Queen's offshore bank accounts. He was managing at one point, I think, about $40 billion, and he was using it to speculate against currencies, famously against Malaysia, where he moved to destroy the currency of the nation. And you do that kind of thing when you want to overthrow a government or create instability. So that's what he's known for. And I will also say there's a tremendous interview, you might be able to find it online, that he did with 60 Minutes some years ago, because he was born in Hungary. I think he was about 13 or 14 years old when the Nazis invaded. His father got him a job working for the Nazis. He pretended he was the godson of a Nazi as opposed to being Jewish, so that he would not get shipped off to a concentration camp. And apparently his first job was delivering notices to the Jewish families that it was time for them to get on the boxcars. And his own father got freaked out about how much he enjoyed doing this. So he then got a second job, which was to steal all of the valuable paintings and jewelry of these Jewish families after they were shipped off. And in the interview, the host actually says to him, so many people who went through this and didn't die in the boxcars or in the concentration camps, but knew that they could have required years of counseling. It's been very traumatic. I mean, this must have been devastating to you to be watching people getting shipped off and saying somewhere in your mind, this could be me. Did you ever have a really hard time with that? And Soros said, oh no, not at all. If I didn't do what I was doing, someone else would have. I mean, and in his book, he actually said that these times were among the happiest of his life.
Isn't that disgusting?
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you.
Yep.
A side note, when you donate on the Black Lives Matter website, you scroll down to the bottom and you see that you're actually donating to actblue.org, which funds all the politicians, that think this certain way.
Yeah. No, it's true. Well, people are thinking, I want to share with you something that I just found so exciting, because we really have become very small in what we think of the United States. People have heard this idea, manifest destiny, which has been perverted to people think of it as some kind of colonial thing or something like that. I'm going to, hold on a second. Oops, wrong thing. This is from a book by David Lilienthal of the FDR administration on the Tennessee Valley Authority. And I want you to think about what this means, because the idea of manifest destiny was that the conception of the divine nature of human beings, and a government that worked to uphold that and allow people to be creative is a superior conception to an oligarchical system where you treat people like animals. And the idea was that this should spread all over the world. That doesn't mean we're the world's policemen or we want to run their governments or anything like that, but you want people to have that conception. So Lilienthal, it's just extraordinary how he describes the TVA and is thinking about it. And I'm just going to read this to you and just reflect for a minute. He says, I write of the Tennessee Valley, but all of this could have happened in almost any of 1,000 other valleys where rivers run from the hills to the sea. For the valleys of the earth have these things in common: the waters, the air, the land, the minerals, the forests. In Missouri and in Arkansas, in Brazil and in the Argentine, in China and in India, there are just such rivers, rivers flowing through mountain canyons, through canebrake and palmetto, through barren wastes, rivers that in the violence of flood menace the land and the people, then sulk in idleness and drought. Rivers all over the world waiting to be controlled by men. The Yangtze, the Ganges, the Ob, the Parana, the Amazon, the Nile. In 1,000 valleys in America and the world over, there are fields that need to be made strong and productive, land steep and rugged, land flat as a man's hand, on the slopes, forests, and in the hills, minerals that can be made to yield a better living for people. Now, that is just magnificent. It's absolutely tremendous. And you think about the evil of the environmentalist movement, which says, oh, human beings are just a cancer on the planet, you only make things worse. Well, Lilienthal describes, and probably people here have read, if you know anything about the Tennessee Valley, this place, it was like hell on earth. You had these horrific floods that would just come and wipe away all the topsoil. Then you would have mosquitoes, you had malaria, you had typhoid fever, you had incredible poverty and backwardness. So who would see the potential in an area that just seemed like death warmed over, where a farmer couldn't even be guaranteed of his livelihood from one year to the next because the water was so out of control, and say, okay, here we're going to build, and I forget if it's 21 or 27 dams and locks and create new man-made lakes. And what happened is the entire valley was totally transformed, not only to produce abundant energy for people, not only to raise their standard of living, eliminate malaria, eliminate typhoid, but also Lilienthal speaks about once the lakes were formed, there were 40 species of fish, that the forests were much more regular. In other words, it became very productive for all of the wildlife and the humanity, that it was an improvement, a transformation of nature that benefited what you would consider nature and man, both. That outlook is what we have to revive in the United States. That is our birthright as Americans. That's the mission of this nation. And I think it's really important for us to take this very, very personally and to see the world in the same way.
Hello. Can
Hello.
I be heard? This
Yes.
is Gary Conitz. I just
wait. I have to tell people, Gary Conitz is way up in DeKalb Junction, New York, and he is my campaign manager. And now that I've said that, oh, and I see Lena and Amalia, and hi.
Lydia's hiding over there on the edge,
Lydia's hiding.
trying to
okay.
stay out of the frame.
Okay, well, her arm is in there. Good,
Yeah.
welcome. And Gary did a fantastic job on our first video. You should watch it on my website. Go ahead.
Thank you. Couple of things. One, in just in terms of what you were just saying in particular, and with everything we're trying to do with bringing up the history of the founding of the country and the whole battle with Britain and the relevance of the mindset of the people that did that, it's important to remember one of the main complaints against the King of England in the Declaration of Independence was his hindering of our bringing more people here and expanding the population, because that growth of the population was synonymous with the idea of improvement in wealth at the time. The whole idea of economic progress and population growth was one and the same thing. So that's on the one thing. And another thing again, and it crosses paths with this whole discussion of the compromises and inadequacies of some of the people, the imperfections of some of the people that were involved in that, that it in the context of what Jason was saying, that some of these people that are these super wealthy philanthropists aren't all that bad. Again, just to add another sort of layer on that, it's also important to remember that just because they might have great intentions doesn't mean they know what's the best place to put their money. And often, and you can see the difference with somebody like Soros, where, I mean, this guy is literally just outright evil, versus somebody like Gates, who makes a lot of bad decisions, doesn't understand economics, believes in this kookery around overpopulation, that, he can be every bit as destructive in some ways as if he had all the bad intentions of Soros. So it's important to remember that what determines the significance of people who act in history is not only their intentions, that's important, but it's, what they finally decide to do is what they're going to be held accountable for. And what the founding fathers did was give us this great country, give us these founding documents, give us these great ideas, and therefore give us the potential for a real future. So I just wanted to add that to what was already said. Thank you.
Mhm.
Great. Jason, do you have any thoughts?
I agree. I mean, and that's one of the things that's so important about the sort of cultural attacks that we're undergoing, is that many of the bad things that many of the ideas that people have that don't serve them or others very well, they don't intend to be evil when they have them. I mean, you talk to some person who says, I'm an environmentalist, I love the environment. They probably, some of them are coming from a bad place, but some of them just sort of think, oh, there's a lot of pollution and it's a problem and the earth is going to boil over, so we should do something about it. Not necessarily a bad intention, but the effect, the neo-colonial effect of environmentalism, especially internationally, in preventing development and maintaining people in forced, terrible, grinding poverty, well, that's a bad thing. And and that's why it's so important that good intentions don't really cut it. I mean, you do have to have good intentions, but you have to also make sure that what your plans are for realizing those intentions is actually going to work. It's actually on the right basis. You can't just say, well, I meant to do something good and I'm sorry it didn't work out well. Well, maybe you should have figured that out. So that's my thought on what you had to say there, Gary.
Hi, Diane.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. That,
For people who don't know, that's Chris, my husband.
yeah, I'm a big supporter of Diane for Senate.
He just says that because his life depends on it. But go ahead.
No, but I wanted to ask you about this because I think it's important to bring up that, you had early on, President Trump had sat down with Pelosi and Schumer, your opponent, on the question of at least $1 trillion infrastructure plan. And I'm sure that President Trump is not talking about solar panels and foolish things like that, but real roads, energy, etc. I mean, the kind of thing that FDR did. Biden today unveiled a $2 trillion plan to move the United States 100% to clean energy, wind and solar. $2 trillion to destroy the energy production of the United States. I mean, if they did succeed in this, it would devastate the nation. It would cost $10 trillion. But I wanted to ask you, I mean, because you brought up Franklin Roosevelt earlier and the TVA, he's calling this the Climate Conservation Corps, the CCC. And it's so disgusting. I wanted to get your thoughts on that fraud. Schumer is also a big proponent of this, and he's saying that he's going to give people vouchers to trade in their cars and get electric cars, and then set up a means to charge electric cars all over the place. But of course, the point is, to do that, you need electricity. Where are you going to get the electricity from? So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks. I would like Jason to respond also. Well, it's genocide. I mean, if you shut down the power grid, one of the problems we have right now is if we wanted to have high-speed electric-powered rail, if we wanted to have a crash program to develop thermonuclear fusion energy, anyone who's visited places like the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, for example, or these other places, you need enormous amounts of energy. We don't even produce the energy now that we need. And when you're talking about solar panels and windmills, you're talking about taking up massive, massive areas of land to produce next to no energy. You couldn't even make solar panels based on solar panel energy because you have to melt aluminum, which requires very, very high temperatures. And in fact, nations like Germany, which idiotically shut down or said they were not going to use nuclear power after Fukushima, are finding that energy costs have completely skyrocketed because solar and wind. Can you have solar energy when it's raining outside? If it's cloudy, if the wind is blowing too fast, then the propellers fall off and kill people or birds or whatever, or the wind is blowing too slow. So there's all these factors that make this energy completely unreliable, and then you have to have a whole backup system on top of it. Plus, Germany is, I think, importing energy from countries that are using nuclear power. So it's just complete hypocrisy, and it costs double or triple or quadruple what we pay for energy here. So it's a genocidal plan which cannot possibly work and would kill a lot of people if he tried to implement it. But Jason, you may have more.
Well, the sort of the way you'd measure these things is what is the amount of effort that's required to produce a certain amount of power. So the amount of effort that is involved, the amount of human effort that's involved in producing solar panels or windmills, it's enormous compared to the kind of pathetic amount of energy that you get from them, especially solar. I mean, wind makes solar look good. Solar is just so stupid. But when you contrast that with nuclear power, where the amount of mining that's involved is far less than coal, because you need such tiny little amounts of uranium to be able to provide all the power that a person needs in a year, the overall productivity, the productive powers of the labor of people involved in providing for the energy required in the economy, their productive power is increased dramatically. Far fewer people are required nowadays to mine coal, even though we make certainly much more coal than 100 years ago, but with far fewer people. So starting from the standpoint of how much energy do we need as a world, and the needs are in the world are for something like thousands of new large power plants. Yes, a couple thousand large power plants, like large-scale nuclear plants or huge coal plants or even more smaller plants. So starting from what we would actually need to have the level of energy intensity that's required for economy, you say, well, what's going to be able to produce that? It's certainly not solar, it's not wind. I mean, unless there's some new physical principle discovered, which might happen, that allows for far more efficient batteries to be made. I mean, there's just you can't store the wind energy for when it isn't windy. It's just completely impractical and designed to be that way. I mean, why is it that so many people who say they're worried about CO2 emissions aren't saying that they love nuclear power? Nuclear power makes tons of energy, doesn't make any CO2. So what's going on that would be overlooked or left aside or attacked? Is the intent truly to improve the environment, or is something else going on? And the idea of repurposing the CCC to something related to climate is, that's really disgusting. Interestingly, the CCC itself had a good impact on the climate. Planting trees makes for much more pleasant environment to be in. Doing work on minor projects around erosion and small flood control projects, small ones, that's a good thing. But I don't think that this climate committee that you mentioned, Chris, would do anything good.
Diane, I think you and your husband make a gorgeous couple.
Thank you.
No flattery intended.
Okay, Chris.
Guys, question.
Yes, go ahead.
All right. So you're putting effort on Putin, who, as you know, before was a colonel in KGB, and he basically quit in '91, and in St. Petersburg, he went into politics, which supported the basically criminal activity. And in '96, he moved and took all of his high friends to Moscow, where, as you know, and he got into Yeltsin. The Yeltsin in '99 put into power. Why are you putting so much effort on thinking he's not going to backstab us?
Well, I would say people from other countries might ask the same question about Donald Trump. They would say, well, you're asking us, let me finish. They're saying, well, why do you want us to trust Donald Trump? I mean, he went and bombed Syria on these fake chemical weapons attacks. He says one thing and then changes his mind and so on. Some people have realized that there's a coup going on in the United States that has to be defeated, which is why the policy is not regular. But there's also a higher question. It's a question of a nation. Russia is a nation which has thousands of nuclear warheads. The United States is a nation that has thousands of nuclear warheads. If these presidents are unable to have a discussion about what's happening in the world, then the world is in a very dangerous situation. Take the case of Turkey. What Putin did to get Turkey to stop backing ISIS in Syria, whatever it was, and I imagine who knows what he said to them, was absolutely critical. Look at what Turkey is about to do right now in Libya. It's extremely dangerous. If you want to get this under control, then you have to have the United States and Russia in a dialogue and in an agreed upon policy. The way that the North Korea talks, which was a total breakthrough, you realize the Korean War is 70 years old and it still has officially not ended. And apparently one of the threats that Obama made to President Trump when he came in is he said, you're going to have a war in the Korean Peninsula. He basically set it up and left it there as a mess. So how did we get the progress? And Trump fired Bolton, among other reasons, for trying to sabotage that, for threatening to give Kim Jong-il the Libya treatment. But how was that handled? It was handled not by the State Department, not by lower level people, but by discussion between Trump and Putin, Trump and Xi Jinping, Trump and Abe, Trump and Moon or Kim in South Korea. In other words, it had to be handled by the heads of state of these nations. So I think it's very important. We're not talking about personal issues or people's personalities or crimes that they may have committed or allegedly committed in the past. You're talking about big history, people who are representing millions of people in their nations and potentially billions, and who have enormous either destructive or productive capability. I mean, if you think about what went into defeating Adolf Hitler, for example, and the alliance that was involved in that, you might say, well, there are certainly things about people. I mean, Stalin was a rather murderous character, but had we not worked with Russia, which paid terribly for fighting against the Nazis, I don't think we would have defeated Hitler. So it's very, very important to think strategically and to also presume that you have a kind of trust, because people are going to be also judged by the people that they represent. And there's a national interest, and therefore it's not a matter of an individual personality or whatever. That's not the same. Now, happily, I think that Putin has done some things that are extremely important, like when he stopped Obama from launching strikes on Syria by proposing that we get rid of chemical weapons. There is a sense, and I suspect, that people where World War II was fought on their soil, the countries in Europe that went through that, it's more real why you would want to try and avoid having a war, let alone a nuclear war, than it is for many people in the United States, including in our military and State Department, who idiotically think that there's such a thing as winning a limited nuclear war. So I'd say you have to think strategically, and you have to think, why is it that every time that Trump and Putin are about to have a conversation, some crazy thing blows up? Mueller indicts 13 Russians, Michael Cohen, this was during, shows up in the Congress to testify. There's always some monkey wrench thrown in to prevent these nations, to prevent the individual leaders of the nations from having a discussion.
My question was, I do agree that, listen, when you get so much nuclear weapons, and I do agree that the talks, launching missiles, it's not the policy. You get a couple of missiles, you crack the whole earth. That's not, but my question is this, is that why do you think that Putin will honor his agreement? Like you said in the World War II, Chamberlain came to English and said, I got this letter and I'm giving you peace from Hitler.
Right.
And what else happened? War happened. Same thing could be here. Putin, this is because I'm watching and I'm following Putin, he is not trustworthy. That's it. That's what I'm trying to make. And to talks, yes, always to talk. Talks are good. I always say talks are very good. But even if he agrees to something, he's not going to honor it. This is what I'm trying to make.
Okay. I disagree with that assessment. I think he has so far been quite straightforward. What he did to stop the overthrow of Assad in Syria, his announcement that had to be done, was really crucial. Imagine if the last secular leader in the Middle East had been overthrown and ISIS had become dominant in the entire region. So that's what history has handed us, and we have to make it work. And I think also I would just say this is why it's very, very urgent that we defeat the British. We have to defeat the British coup. Look, Chamberlain and then Churchill, the British set up the war. they created the Versailles, this paper that Putin wrote about the history of World War II was a tremendous intervention because he talks about the perfidy of the British. They set up the Munich sellout where they had said, oh no, we'll protect everyone. And then they went ahead and told Poland, go ahead and take a chunk of Czechoslovakia. You can have that. And so they were lying because it was the view. And Churchill also kept telling FDR, don't send any weapons to the Soviet Union. They're not going to fight. They're just going to run away and give up. And everything you send the Soviets is going to end up in the hands of the Nazis. Why? Because the British wanted Russia and Germany to grind each other up and destroy each other so that the British would be the hegemonic power. And as you may know, Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Brown Brothers Harriman, Prescott Bush, who was a fanatical eugenicist, were censured by the United States Congress for aiding the enemy in the time of war. Prescott Bush was funding Hitler and the Nazis during World War II.
Well, here's
Diane?
the
Diane?
thing about
Yes.
Syria.
May I
One more-
interrupt?
Yes.
Times now, your protests about our wanting to work with Russia and the president of Russia. I would like to ask a question on another subject. Would you yield the floor to me, Sergey?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good. I've met a person, Diane, who was invited and isn't participating in your meeting here tonight, who works in the MTA and wishes to remain anonymous, but he reported to me that so many of our MTA workers have already died of COVID, and the policy of our New York City budget is that we can't hire anyone to replace them. So the guys who are already on shifts are taking extra shifts, and he himself also had COVID and some very serious medical consequences, but continues to work. And they work in a small supervisor's office where 4 or 5 of them work closely together. They have to remove their masks to be able to correspond with their crews. It's a real nightmare. So we have an immediate program that you represent in your campaign with Daniel as our national drive to bring LaRouche's solution, which is 1.5 billion productive jobs worldwide, but just here in the US alone, 50 million. And I remember, Diane, when you were launching your ideas for these campaigns in the area, from New York, New Jersey, you had proposed a great project here on, I can't even remember, it's big gates in the water and tunnels and a huge infrastructure grid for this area. I think it would be very inspiring to just give people a glimpse of what a piece of that 50 million US jobs would look like in even our region, which is where you and Daniel's running for New Jersey Senate, you're running for New York Senate. The ideas that we can bring to bear in our economy here, because I don't think anybody here even remembers, what a productive economy looks like. And President Trump has been romanced by Wall Street to boast that we are in a productive economy because we have a soaring stock market, fed by the bubble. And so I think it would be a nice
well, I'll just say that Jason and I actually worked closely, and he may want to say more about the transportation system. And our friend, the late Hal Cooper, who was a railroad expert, actually at one point was proposing that we should rebuild the entire subway system under the current one. We should just start from scratch in the bedrock and make a fully modernized subway system, because there are many issues, including the signals and so on, that are from World War II, and parts of it are being modernized, etc. What you're referring to is the storm surge barrier between the Sandy Hook and the Rockaways, which was proposed by the American Society of Civil Engineers in 2009, when it would have cost $7 billion. It's a 5-mile long sea gate that is open when the seas are calm, and when you hear of a hurricane coming, you close the gate, and it would have protected all of, well, of course, Staten Island, all of lower Manhattan, New York, New Jersey, the port of Newark, the port of Elizabeth. None of that would have been damaged had we built this sea gate. and we should build it now. One other aspect of one of the designs is actually, I think, a tunnel under this thing for rail or highway. Imagine being able to drive directly from the Rockaways to New Jersey or New Jersey to the Rockaways to get to Long Island, bypassing the Manhattan traffic. I mean, this thing would be tremendous, not to mention all the people it would employ. And I'm setting some things into motion on getting that promoted right now. But if Jason has more to say about the New York subway system, because actually there's a number of people who have been active in the LaRouche PAC, interestingly from Long Island, many of them who work for the MTA, many. And I think people might be interested to know what we have to say about that.
Well, there's a lot of projects that could be done, and I agree with Hal that some of this, building an entirely new line, could be a good idea, because you can then really go with the latest technologies in its entirety, including things like, platform doors, so that you can't just like fall in the tracks or throw trash in the tracks that then catches fire and delays everybody. So that's one thing. The Second Avenue subway, this is something that's been planned for decades and decades and decades. It's this tiny extension cost a fortune, but that's really should go all the way up into the Bronx to relieve pressure on the 456, which is just, it's completely at capacity. The path should be extended out to Newark Airport. That would just be, it's just a couple of miles. That would make a total lot of sense. There are new lines that should be built inside New York, but, more broadly, to look at the region, let's talk about high-speed rail. So high-speed rail between New York and Boston on the current right-of-way, it's just not possible. There's too many tight bends and curves that if you were going on a high-speed train, you'd be, thrown left and right on it if the train doesn't fly off the tracks. So an entirely new northeast, corridor from New York City heading up, and then really going more through the, the middle part of Maryland, Massachusetts, to Boston. You could open up a new area that would now have high-speed rail access. You should also fix up the current Northeast corridor, but that's one example. The projects needed for rebuilding the tunnels under the Gateway project, not everything about it is a good idea, but it's desperately needed to expand and then repair these the tunnels under the Hudson that are just over 100 years old and in really bad trouble. So those are a few of the transportation things that should be done. Some of the other ones, East Side access, it seems like it's never going to be finished. Really committing to helping make that happen as fast as possible would be really good, because when these projects take a long time, it makes them cost much more than if you get them done more quickly. It really drags out the cost. And, a connection between Penn Station and Grand Central, a direct rail connection, wouldn't that be something? So there's a lot of things that could be done if you're thinking really big in the city, in addition to the setting up the automatic controls and the communication systems and all these other things that need doing. But in terms of building that next platform of entirely new lines, of high-speed rail in the region, of upgrading the connection across the Hudson, those are a few of the projects around here that could productively employ many people and overall make the area just, easier to get around, better place to live.
To extend it, one thing that would make a lot of sense, but we'd have to get New Jersey to agree, is we should build an entirely new city, probably in the Pine Barrens, which are 22% of the state of New Jersey, which is outrageous. And there actually was a plan in the 1980s to make a science city there, because you only need a few square miles. You would still have plenty of Pine Barrens. But if you had high-speed rail, then you could move a bunch of people out of New York while you fixed all the infrastructure, so have a whole new city built, and have a whole new generation of young scientists and people coming out of this new city. But we don't even think in those terms anymore. So if there's not anything else, I think we could wrap up this discussion. I'm really glad for everyone who was here. I'm really glad that Gary could join myself and Jason Ross. Gary Cannett's my campaign manager. I'm glad my husband, Chris, made an appearance. And
Hey, Diane.
yeah, Don, hi. Good to see you.
Called to say hi.
Yes. Hi.
It was great show. Great, talk.
Great. Well, thank you. I would like to encourage everyone to join us tomorrow night, myself and Daniel Burke. Please look in the chat. If you're on video, there's a link where you can register for that, or you can go to burkeforsenate.com. It's BURKE, the numeral 4, senate.com, and you can get a link there, and it'll be a 7 p.m. Zoom meeting where we're really going to take up much more in depth, a much bigger discussion, and I think there's going to be people on from all over the country, how to this 50 million jobs program, and also some of these urgent questions, because if we don't take COVID seriously and take the measures to address it and actually stop it, as Jason said, continuing in a kind of half-baked way, it's going to be with us forever. And you will get places where it starts spreading exponentially again. And we should not put ourselves through that. So I think that's it. And we'll
Thank
talk
you
to
all.
everyone. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.